Welcome to our final chapter titled Sex for Sale. We're going to be talking about prostitution and pornography in this chapter. I would like to point out to any listeners that are under the age of 18 that this content is not intended for children. If you are one of my students, of course, you are absolutely welcome to be listening to this. If you are not one of my students and you find this content offensive, you might want to move on. So let's start off by defining prostitution. The practice or occupation of engaging in sexual activity with someone for payment. The payment is typically thought of as money, but it could be anything that is bartered. So it could be drugs or food or shelter, whatever the person needs. It can be any kind of payment. It's a direct quid pro quo type of situation, though, where there will be an actual exchange of services for some kind of payment. Sometimes people talk about prostitution being a relationship situation where a person is in a relationship and that relationship provides shelter and access to the other things that the person needs. If it's a relationship, we're not talking about prostitution. Prostitution is a contractual arrangement that is quid pro quo, this for that. Relationships are something different. Now, I'm going to share with you that part of my understanding of prostitution has changed thanks to the relationship that I had with a former student. When I first started teaching this class, I was following the very, sort of small L libertarian type of attitude about prostitution that, if anything between consenting adults, is probably okay. Until I met a student who entered into prostitution as an adult, but argues that she became dependent on prostitution. She got lured into it, I should say, that she considers herself to have been trafficked because it wasn't, she was lured through very clever mechanisms that even though she was an adult, she didn't really see where it was going until she was already in it. Now, what I'm trying to do is show you an article from the Seattle Times showing you this student was profiled, but apparently my internet doesn't want to open it up. But she really informed my understanding of prostitution in a way that I had not really considered before. And so I'll make sure to build on what's in our textbook with some of the insights that she's provided to me as far as, the perspective from the prostitutes themselves. She really doesn't believe in using the phrase sex worker for women who are in situations like she was, or men who are in situations like she was, where she was not really there on an equal footing with the people who were paying her for sex. And so sex worker is probably an okay term in certain circumstances, but she felt like in her circumstances and the circumstances of a lot of the prostitutes that we're going to be talking about, they don't really have free will. And so it's not really work. It's something else. Now, this is an anonymous quote that says that prostitutes have been very improperly styled as women of pleasure. They are women of pain or sorrow, of grief, of bitter and continual repentance. So a lot of times we sort of imagine Pretty Woman or something like that, where it's, a way up or something else. And a lot of times it's not. So who becomes a prostitute in the U.S.? Now, keep in mind, we're talking about the U.S. because, it's hard enough to get good data on prostitutes in the U.S. because it is something that is illegal in most states and in most municipalities. And it's something that is, the people who are in it oftentimes are very scared to share information. They're afraid of their pimp or they're afraid of the law, things like that. And so it's hard to collect really good data on the U.S. and then to make worldwide assumptions would be completely wrong. So we're just going to talk about in the U.S. So some of the risk factors that make it more likely that a person might become a prostitute. Sexual abuse. It's a really common for prostitutes to report that they were sexually abused when they were younger. A lot of times it's in that delicate age between the onset of puberty and then, mid-adolescence, certainly before the age of consent. So sexual abuse of some sort, maltreatment of some sort, I'm hesitant to just say dysfunctional household because, most households have their moments. We're talking about actual maltreatment where a person is deprived of food or clothing or they are abused or something beyond just sort of a normal teenager feeling angsty. Neglect. Unsupervised youths are very, it's a risky thing. They oftentimes can get themselves into situations that they didn't recognize were coming up, and then next thing you know, they've run away from home or they've been lured by a pimp. My former student does a really great talk on this, and I feel inadequate compared to how she talks about it. But one of the things that she does is sort of imitates what pimps will say to a young potential prostitute in order to lure them into the life. They'll say things like, "Oh, you're my girlfriend. I love you. Come on, mama, you're so pretty." Things like that. And then it's not long before that person is saying, "Well, can you have sex with my friend? I owe him something, and this will be a way for me to get out of what I owe him," or things like that. And just it's very insidious. And a neglected child who doesn't have somebody supervising them is more prone to come in contact with someone like that who can lure them. Absenteeism from school and disinterest in school is oftentimes associated with going on to become a prostitute, and having a lack of social connections of your peers, right? Where it feels like, nobody would really even care. I might as well just leave home. It makes a person more vulnerable to pimps and to traffickers. Runaways. People who run away oftentimes are fleeing one of the things that I've already listed, but they think that they're going to be better off on their own, and then they discover life on the street is pretty awful, and they're hungry or they're cold or they're really hot or whatever, and they're just desperate to improve their conditions. And so they say that the average runaway spends about 36 hours on the streets of a downtown area before they're approached by a pimp. That's pretty shocking that so quickly word gets around and pimps or traffickers will approach that person and offer them food or offer them a place to stay, give them the sense that they'll be secure with them, and then can take advantage of them. General rebelliousness is part of the risk factors for prostitution. A person who, pretty much thinks that the adults are out to get them or not on their side or don't know what they're talking about, they're more likely to do some of the risky behaviors like trying drugs and alcohol and thinking that they know enough to be able to leave home without, supervision and those kinds of things. And again, it makes the person vulnerable to pimps and to traffickers. So a person who becomes a prostitute does not necessarily have all of these things in their past, but there's just sort of this pattern of, these kinds of things tend to be present in a person who finds themselves in prostitution later. So who becomes a prostitute? Well, one big question is it something like I had always thought about it as being a choice, or is it more commonly something that happens through force? So the top picture is sort of one of those fantasies of what it's like to be a prostitute. And the bottom picture is a lot of the reality, especially around the world, of, underage girls being sold by their families or negotiated, by their families into prostitution. And so when we look at it as children, I think we have to all agree that children can't give their consent. And so they are not part of a consenting adult interaction. Interestingly, a lot of people who are in favor of legalizing, I almost said marijuana, legalizing prostitution will refer to underage girls who are in prostitution as women, prostituted women. They'll refer to them, or they'll call them sex workers, and they're underage. And, we've already talked about in a previous chapter the statutory rape laws that a person who's underage cannot give their consent. In some states, the age is as young as 16. But we're talking about girls who are being prostituted and little boys who are being prostituted who are, 11 and 12 years old. So we're not talking about, it's questionable. This is a 16-year-old in a state where the legal consent law is 16. That we're not talking about that. We're talking about underage by all measures, being entered into prostitution. And sometimes by the time the researchers or the social workers find them, they now are 16 maybe, but they've been in the life for a couple of years. And so we always have to look at the possibility that a person who's 18, 20 years old, they may have entered it when they were underage and they didn't really have a free choice. If we look at victims of trafficking worldwide, by types of exploitation, you see that 70% are exploited for forced labor. They're trafficked into what we would call slave labor, right, where the person is being forced to work. 22% are trafficked for sexual exploitation. And it's partly prostitution. It also can be pornography, which is also part of this chapter. 3% are trafficked for forced labor and sexual acts. And then we have the smaller groups that are to be beggars on the street or to engage in low-level criminal activities. So the vast majority of victims of trafficking are for forced labor, but then the next largest group include, sexual exploitation. So we have to wonder about how many people are entering voluntarily and how many are entering by force through trafficking. So now here we have global trends in the share of women and girls among the total numbers of victims of trafficking. And so again, now remember, this is not all going to be sexual trafficking, but what we're seeing is a drop in the number of women, which are the burgundy bar, and an increase in the number of girls that are being trafficked. So traffickers are luring younger targets and entering them into forced labor or forced sexual exploitation at higher rates. Now, this little billboard that I got from the National Human Trafficking Resource Center said that there's 100,000 to 300,000 sexually exploited children in the United States, that sex trafficking is the second largest source of profits for international organized crime, behind only drugs. Girls as young as 5 have been known to have been trafficked. And in fact, my student who, she did leave prostitution and now works for an anti-prostitution group in Seattle. And she said that they had gotten a girl out of prostitution in Canada and she was 9 years old. So like firsthand knowledge of somebody that's way too young to be trafficked into prostitution. 14 is the average age of a trafficked victim in the United States. So well below the age of consent in any state. It's a $32 billion industry, and 27 million people are enslaved around the world today. We oftentimes talk about slavery and things as something that happened in the past, but it is really common for people to be enslaved for either sex exploitation or forced work around the world. 800,000 people are trafficked each year. Less than $100 is the typical price that a family will get for selling their daughter into a brothel. So this girl in this lower picture, her parents got probably about $100 at the most for selling her into a life of prostitution. And then this last statistic, it's a little, we're not clear, but somewhere between 14,500 and 17,500 victims are trafficked into the U.S. each year. So they're brought from other places in order to either engage in forced labor or engage in prostitution or pornography. So that's a lot of people being brought into the U.S. And a lot of times people are really unaware that trafficking occurs within and into the U.S. All right, I'm going to stop here and we'll come back and we'll talk about drug use and prostitution in our next lecture.